declares the Lord, for Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these surrounding nations. I will devote them to destruction and make them a horror, a hissing, and everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will banish from them the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the grinding of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation and the land of the Chaldeans for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste, and I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it. So this idea that the land would become a waste and the nations would serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So I would have you note that. And then it says after the 70 years are completed. And so this concept of this is going to be a 70-year period was very clear in the book of Jeremiah. So the first question was, were the Israelites aware of this 70 years? Was this something that they were cognizant of? Well, I think there's a few passages would tell us they were hyper aware. In fact, they may have been too aware that this was supposed to be 70 years. Let's split up these verses. Dad, if you don't mind, Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Roger, if you don't mind, Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Michael, Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 12. And then I'll turn to 2 Chronicles. Notice how many times these Old Testament writers refer to this prophecy. This was not something that we look back on and notice how it was fulfilled centuries later. In real time, the Israelites were extremely aware that God had promised that this was to last 70 years. So let's begin first with Daniel. And again, this Daniel in real time kind of comes to this comprehension. Dad? So Daniel, during this time that he is in captivity himself, gets a copy of the scroll of Jeremiah and comes to this comprehension that it's going to be 70 years. He was not alone. Ezra chapter 1, the writer of Ezra is speaking to people in real time. In order to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, the writer of Ezra says in the very first verse of his book, this was in order to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. Michael? So Zechariah, and we'll study more about his prophecy as we move on in this class, but Zechariah in his prophecy says, for these 70 years, you have disregarded this people. And if you go to 2 Chronicles, the very last book of 2 Chronicles, and one of the last few verses, in chapter 36, beginning of verse 20, as the chronicler is recording all these things that are happening in the nation of Judah, he says, he took it to exile into Babylon, those who escaped the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons to the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. So, the exiles, I think based on these passages, I would say these exiles, and remember these exiles were among the most religious of the religious leaning of the people that were taken to Babylon. They were extremely aware that this was a 70-year prophecy. I got a feeling this was always on their minds. This was a constant topic at the dinner table and around the water cooler, as it were, of the day. That this 70 years was something that was always on their minds. And so this fulfillment by Cyrus and this coming back to Jerusalem was, in their minds, definitely a fulfillment of this prophecy. And so that, I think that helps us understand a little bit of the disillusionment that we see when the progress on rebuilding the temple is stopped, right? So there's this great return after 70 years that God has answered all of our prayers and we're going to return. And their understanding of what came after this 70-year period was probably pretty dim. And there's going to be this revival of the nation of Israel, and we're going to return back to the kingdom of Solomon. And meanwhile, they're there for a couple years and none of this happens. The exiles return and they're just this ragtag bunch that continues to get picked on by the Samaritans, and they're really struggling, as we learn in the book of Haggai. You can definitely see where disillusionment would set in. What happened to our 70 years, that this nation was going to return to prosperity, and here we are struggling day to day, even though we've tried to do the right thing and come back. So you can definitely see where that frustration, that disillusionment would set in. So how many more minutes have I got? Just a couple more minutes on. So how is this prophecy fulfilled? And that's the more interesting question. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. I'm going to put some thoughts up on the board, but for your own study, because you can go way down the rabbit hole on this, and I have been partially down that rabbit hole. So how was this 70-year prophecy fulfilled? And there's a few different ideas out there of how this prophecy may have been fulfilled. One is, and if you read the prophecy itself in Jeremiah, it says, we'll get the exact language. Jeremiah 25, it says, "These nations shall serve the king of Babylon." And so did that 70 years refer to just the time period of the Babylonian Empire? Well, we can get pretty close if we look at the dates, and I know that's small, I apologize. We know that Jehoiakim kind of becomes king in 609, and he's not really a king. This is at the end of the nation of Judah. He is not really a king that has any authority. He is operating as a vassal to other nations. So Judah kind of ceases existing, operating as an independent sovereign nation in about 609. And we know that the Babylonian Empire itself falls. Remember that story we talked about before, the handwriting on the wall, and the very next night, Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom. That happens, history tells us, in 539. So that's 70 years. So that math kind of works there. You could talk me into that being an option, that the Babylonian Empire lasted about 70 years. There are other people who will tell you, well, what about the temple itself? Maybe we can make that math work. Again, history tells us that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple in 586 BC. And we're going to read this morning where the temple of Zerubbabel was completed in the 6th year of Darius, king of Persia. Again, history tells us that's about 516 BC. That works out to about 70 years. So maybe that's the 70 years we're talking about. Or maybe we're talking about the time that the children of Israel were actually in exile. Well, we know that from the book of Daniel, we know that those first exiles were taken by Nebuchadnezzar in about 606 BC. And we know that Cyrus issued his decree and allowed those first exiles to return about 536 BC. That's 70 years. So you can read different scholars that would offer any of those options for how this 70 years is completed. John, you got a comment here. You brought this up, so you need to lead us down the right path here. Yes. 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 So Jeremiah prophesied that there would be 70 years, that the land would be desolate, that they would serve the king of Babylon. Could you talk me into multiple of these being true? That this one refers to the land being desolate, and this one refers to, God can do whatever he wants to do, right? So if he wants to make this prophecy true in many different ways, I would even go for that option. But without question, the children of Israel were very aware that this was to last 70 years. You could even convince me that what we're getting ready to read in Haggai is a result of the people being too aware that it was 70 years, that the temple was destroyed in 586. And so they say, well, 70 years, I don't even know that we're supposed to get this temple done until 516 in order to fulfill this prophecy. So, and using that as an excuse not to work on the temple. So Anyway, I think all of that is interesting in this context, that God's prophecies and His will kind of evolving and being fulfilled in real time, and the people being aware of it, I think make this very interesting. Okay, so 14 minutes. I didn't do too bad, but we've only got 2 classes on Haggai, and it's only 2 chapters. So I think we could spend a little time hammering down the prophecy. But we are going to start this morning in Haggai. So with that as the backdrop, I think that kind of leads us to Haggai chapter 1. Haggai is kind of sneakily probably my favorite minor prophet, because I think it is incredibly relevant in the lessons that it teaches. So as a reminder, the book of Ezra gives us a very specific place in chronology where the prophets Haggai and Zechariah show up. So what has happened? The exiles have returned, but what has happened to prompt Haggai and Zechariah to show up? They quit building the temple. And in response to what did they quit building the temple? What's that? They got a little persecution, right? They got a little persecution from the people around them, depending how you understand Ezra chapter 4, maybe even a decree from the king that says, let's just put a pause on this until I understand this situation a little better. But they've gotten some persecution from their neighbors, maybe even a little bit of governmental persecution, and the building has stopped. Do you remember from last class how long the building stopped? 15, 16 years. Yeah. So for 16 years, what are we doing in Israel? We're building pretty nice subdivisions. We got panels, we got wainscoting, but we don't have a temple, and so that's what's happening in Israel. So which leads us to kind of our first question: what is Haggai's? Remember, there's only 2 chapters here, but man, they're pretty intense. What is Haggai's clear purpose in his writing to the children of Israel? One more. Sorry, there's 2 at once. I couldn't catch them. Stir the people up. We got to continue this building project. Yes, because and it is obvious from his teaching, the stopping of the building is just a symptom of the people's spiritual kind of malaise. And so, yes, this temple was critically important, but this temple, and Haggai's pretty clear about this, this temple is symptomatic. It's symbolic of the way that they have kind of changed their priorities. Yes. And that's very important. So he's going to connect their physical condition, John's point, he's going to connect their physical condition to their spiritual decay. So I want you, and I think it's important in this context, is remember who we're speaking to. Who were these Israelites that Haggai is speaking to? These are the Israelites that had the faith and the gumption and the zeal to travel all the way across the world to come back to Jerusalem. These are the most, again, on the spectrum of least religiously inclined to most religiously inclined Israelites, these guys are way over here. These are the most religiously inclined Jews of the day. And these are the ones that get bogged down in day-to-day life. Man, that is, put a pin in that. That's pretty relevant. And I have to think that, imagine you're one of these Israelites. You have traveled across the world to rebuild something that has been completely leveled. You've been there several years. You are really struggling. Very clear from the book of Haggai, you are really struggling economically. I mean, every day it's frustrating. You don't seem to be being blessed. You've come back to do God's will, and you are just every day is a struggle. I mean, you are subsistence living day to day. And Haggai says, well, if you had more faith, this wouldn't be a problem. That I don't want us to miss that's pretty bold. To the most religious people among the Jews, Haggai comes back and says, you don't have to live like this. All this struggling that you guys are doing, it's kind of your own fault. That's got to hit pretty hard. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes. 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 You shouldn't have been in this position, and yet here you are. And man, I just have to think how this would hit if you are an Israelite, that you are struggling day to day, and Haggai says, it's your own fault. What do you mean it's my own fault? I'm planting the crops, I'm trying to do the thing, I've come back to the day. It's your own fault. That's a hard, I think we all would know that's a hard lesson to hear. So Haggai comes back, and if you want to put a pin in perhaps the verse that kind of sums it all up, build the house that I may take pleasure in it and that I may be glorified, says the Lord. That I may be glorified. Build the house, and that's ESV. Your version may render that a little differently. Build the house that I may be glorified. What they were doing was not glorifying God. But instead, Haggai wants them to build the house that they may be glorified. One quick note before we move on to question 2. There's a couple of things from the first 2 verses that I just think stand out to me, kind of put us in the right context. In Haggai chapter 1, verse 1, what is Zerubbabel? First of all, there's 2 people that the first prophecy is addressed to, Zerubbabel and Jeshua. But what is Zerubbabel? How's he referred to in this context? Governor of Judah. Governor of Judah. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be a governor of Judah? Yes. Exactly right. He was a representative of Darius, right? He ran this little part of the world on behalf of Darius, the king of Persia. If God's people had been faithful through the years, what would Zerubbabel have been? Likely, based on his lineage. He'd been king. It'd have been King Zerubbabel. Again, put yourself in the shoes of these people. They know that Zerubbabel is of the lineage of David. Perhaps they even think of him as keeping some of that kingly lineage. This is very clearly a subservient. You're running this on behalf of somebody else. You are not a sovereign people. You're a governor. You're not a king. We don't probably get that impact. I got a feeling that those people would have taken that stings a little. You're a governor. And then verse 2, thus says the Lord. How does the Lord refer to the Israelites in verse 2? These people, or this people. That stings a little too. If you're an Israelite, how might you expect God to refer to you? My people. No, that's not what Haggai brings to them in verse 2. These people say, and then they give their excuse. So, Haggai comes pretty hard, pretty fast. The tone of Haggai, and we'll compare that to Zechariah as we go through the class a little bit. The tone of Haggai is pretty intense. He's got a lot to get into 2 chapters. He had to dive right in. Yes, sir. This is great lead-in. Correct. Yes. Yeah, I think that's excellent. And you go all the way back to Solomon. Was it, it's a different study. Was it God's intent that we have this ornate meeting place? And what would the writer of let's see, was it Acts? Was it Stephen that said, we know that God does not dwell in temples made with hands, that's not his gig, and yet he says, build the house that I may be glorified. I would submit, as John says, that it was more about being glorified than it was building the house. That had the people just slapped up a temple, but it wasn't to the glory of God, that we'd had a different outcome. Yes. 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 So, and to your point, as we move into the New Testament, if we want to make the direct parallel, what is the temple of God today? We are the temple of God today. So all of these lessons that would God come say to us, build the house of the Lord that I may be glorified. Instead, you're going around building your own houses. That's I think how Haggai gets pretty super relevant. Uh, good point, John. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, ma'am. Yes. 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 And to Carol's point, we have to get back to prioritizing God correctly, right? That this again, the temple is a symptom. This is not about uh, a building per se. It's about what's stopping that building and not caring about that building means about their spiritual condition. That they are not glorifying God, that instead they're glorifying themselves, right? We're to Roger's point, we got it on pretty good from Ezra chapter 1. We know pretty clearly that they came with some possessions that they were funded when they originally came to Israel. What happened to that stuff? I'm not a macroeconomic, but you know, if all of those resources went into their own houses, who are they glorifying? And that I think that's the message here. So question number 2 in our material: what excuse of the people does Haggai record? So let's start with that first. Specifically, the people give what excuse, and how does Haggai record it? What was that? It's not time. It's not time. The ESV, the time has not yet come. You look at some different translations, it's not the right time. And I'm specifically talking about verse 2. Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people, remember that, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. It's not the right time. So what's the 2021 parallel excuse? Too busy. It's not the right time. There's too much going on. That's a good one. I got other things that I need to take care of before I can focus on that. It's what's that? I've got things to do, right? I got personal issues to take care of before I can invest that kind of energy in this spiritual thing. Miss Carol, do you have something else? ooh, that's a good one. Yes. This needs to be done. I hope somebody does it. And by the way, with that excuse, note that they're not questioning the necessity of this. They're not even questioning the obligation of this. This needs to be done. I need to do it. This is just not the right time for me to get her to do this because of. So let's go back to the exiles for a moment. What factors were going around in their lives that might have made this not the right time? What might have given this some validity in their minds? How did they excuse this? What was going on? Yes. Let's not get carried away and cause a stir here. The king has said we're going to pause and investigate this matter. Let's just wait for this all to get sorted out governmentally. Yes. God wouldn't want us to live in tents in the meantime, right? Yes. Yes. So guys, we're kind of in this holding pattern. We're going to see how this all works out governmentally. We also we've got some persecution that's happening from the peoples around about us, just as a kind of a prudential question, as a question of, is this the right thing to do? Maybe we shouldn't rock the boat right now. And hey, as you know, the 70 years since the temple has been destroyed is not over yet. This is probably not the right time to start marching into a big scale building project. Yes. Yes. And there certainly was a thought that Cyrus was God ordained messenger. Now remember that by the time we get to Haggai, Cyrus has been gone for 13, 14 years. Not quite that long, but a few years. But yes, for sure, there's some knowledge of, are we playing out the string on the 70 years? One other thing to remember is how are we doing economically right now? Not great. Not great. Where are we going to get the funds to pay craftsmen and pay for timber and all the things? Like, temples just don't spring up out of the ground. It's even in 500 BC, it still takes resources to build a structure. Where's this money going to come from? Let me wait we should probably wait until things get a little better economically, and then we'll have some resources to be able to really put toward this effort. There are so many things that you could list that the Israelites would use to say this is just not the right time. It's just not the right time. Yes, sir. Yes. Yes. There's certainly that. Certainly could be that piece of it. Maybe they should just build slowly. Yeah, maybe they could do that. So, I don't want to belabor the point, but is this relevant in 2021? Of course, every one of these things is relevant. I'm not economically in a position where I can take the time off to come worship God. My life is not in a position where I can really dedicate a lot of time and energy to these things to help the Lord's kingdom. Governmentally, this is probably not the right time to be talking about and moving forward on God's projects. That's not really popular in the current environment. Maybe it might just be best to lay low for a little while and not cause any disturbance. All of those, I think, are incredibly relevant. I think Haggai's are relevant. Yes, which kind of leads to our next question. So that's a good lead in. So we've talked about this a little bit, but let's just flesh it out. How had Jehovah attempted to get the exiles' attention? He'd withheld the rain, hardships, right? And you can read all of those verses 9 through 11, and it was widespread. It wasn't just one industry, so to speak. This is widespread. It's about in verse 11, it's about the grain, about the wine, about the oil, about the man and beast, and about all their labors. Across the board, this has been an economic depression. What was the intent of all of that? To get their attention, yeah. Did it work? They did show reverence in verse 12. So this did work when? Haggai had to kind of connect the dots for them. Because this has been going on, it appears, for some time. That we've got some serious economic issues, but it took Haggai to come connect the dots. Say, hey guys, do you know why when you go to the vat to get 20 measures, you only get 10? I'm probably butchering the exact words there, but you know why you're putting your money into a purse with holes? Otherwise, that sound like anything that you might hear today? There's too much month left at the end of the money. That's exactly how the Israelites felt. Why do I feel like I'm putting my money into a purse with holes? So the next question, be careful with this one. Does God still operate in this manner? I think so. I think so. So we got to be careful with this, right? We got to be careful that we don't veer straight into health and wealthology, right? But does God still operate in this manner? I think there's plenty of evidence that he does. Dad referenced Matthew 6:33. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added. What things has he just talked about? Food, clothing, shelter, about all these things that the Gentiles seek, Matthew 6:33. So, and then the last part of this question, have we witnessed this? Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good. So that's a good. And Roger said he read the question a little differently, which is probably a great reading. Is it really took the preaching of Haggai for the people to connect the dots, right? And that is hyper relevant. How are we going to get people today to connect the dots? But yes, yes. So that's an excellent. Probably a better answer to a question I didn't intend to ask is what does it require? So yes, does living apart from God at times cause physical hardships? For sure. Is there going to be a recognition of that all the time, or what does it take to connect the dots? It may take a Haggai um, to help people connect the dots. Yes, 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 yes. Correct. So that's what makes this challenging. Go ahead. Sorry. Yes. Well said. So if things are going poorly for us, economically, physically, socially, is that 100% always for sure a judgment from God because of our actions? Of course not. If things are going great, is it always 100% for sure a blessing from God because our actions are great? Of course not. But do we think that at times God does, that our own actions, consequences of our own actions cause hardships, which is a form of judgment? Yes. So in all of those things, the challenging part is whether things are going well or going poorly, what should we be doing? Examining ourselves. I think that is the key. That's the key here, is that the people of Haggai doesn't appear ever sit down and said, well, things are going poorly. Is there choices that I'm making that are causing this, or the choices that we're making that are causing this? That this examination piece, it's an opportunity to kind of evaluate and say, I'm going to keep doing, things are going poorly here, but we're, you know, following God the best I know how, and we're doing the right things, and that's where we're going to put my faith. Or things are going poorly here, and I'm not spending any time on God's things. Is that time to reevaluate and see if, to Haggai's point, to see if following God leads to better outcome? Yes, consider your ways. Think about what you're doing, depending on the version. He says that multiple times, and that is exactly, I think, what Shane noted there. Consider your ways. Evaluate what you're doing. Is there a connection between A and B? And as we noted, the challenging part here is it's not always. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. But it is a good opportunity for us to evaluate whether or not our our condition has anything to do with our direction. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Yes. Yes. So it's interesting. When things are going poorly, examine yourselves. When things are going well, examine yourselves. I would say when things are kind of middle of the road, examine yourself. It seems like that this seems to be like God gives us all of these opportunities to evaluate, am I still on the path here? Am I moving in the right direction here? Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's a good thought. Um, you know, providence is is a is a real tricky. It's a slippery little thing to get your hands around because by its nature, if you look up the definition, it's God providing something, but it's easy to assign that to something else, right? It's not. In fact, it's impossible to clearly say in real time, well, this is because of this. God's doing this. That time and chance happens and other things happen, but with the benefit of some time and perspective, I think many times we look back and say, yeah, I see where God was putting these things in place for that to happen. But it's it's impossible to do in real time. So all we can do, I think, is consider our ways, um, as they were told to do in Haggai. But good conversation. And so as we get to toward the end of chapter 1, how effective was Haggai and how quickly? He was very effective and pretty quickly. How quickly? 23 days. 23 days, a little 3-week revival, and everybody turned around. Now you talk about, that's pretty phenomenal. Now we know that Zechariah was also involved. We know that Zerubbabel and Jeshua were no doubt involved, but this turnaround is pretty miraculous. So that kind of starts there in verse 12. And who in general, who has to start like real turnarounds of the people? Where does that often start? Leadership, right? So it's noted in verse 1 that the first time the word of the Lord came to Haggai, it was specifically for who? It was specifically for the leaders. It was for Zerubbabel and Jeshua. So I would contend that what is said in verse 2 is part of a prophecy that's specifically for Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And then when you get to verse 3, there's a broader Haggai speaking to all the people. But I don't think I'm reading too much into that. It appears that verse 2 is specifically for those leaders. In verse 12, it's those leaders who specifically took that to heart. It was Zerubbabel and Joshua that obeyed the word of the Lord, and they spurred on this work. And so on the 24th day of the 6th month, we got progress again moving forward in these days of Darius. As we move on, there's other great lessons from Haggai chapter 2 we'll talk about next class. But if you're reading the book of Ezra, how long from here until the completion of the temple? Anybody know that answer? Uh-huh. About 4 years. Yeah. So this is about once we got moving along, and I'm not sure about the time of the year, but in the neighborhood of a 4-year project, once we kind of got the gears meshing again, we had about a 4-year project. Next class on Wednesday evening, we're going to be talking about Haggai chapter 2. And what does sin do to our worship is a really interesting kind of point that Haggai makes in Haggai chapter 2. So we'll flesh that out in detail, and we'll finish up the short book of Haggai. Any last questions or comments before we close up shop this morning? Ooh, what does the name Haggai mean? Should have. You got me. You got me. I did read that. Festival of Yahweh. I did see that. Thank you. And for what it's worth, from what I read, it's probably likely that Haggai was one of these 42,000. There's most likely he was one of these that have been there the whole time. Yeah, that's under some debate. How old was Haggai? Did he see the old temple? There's some note there in chapter 2 that there's some that remembered this house. I don't get from that reading that he's necessarily one of those, but I could definitely be wrong. Did Haggai ever see the old house? Yes. Yeah, conjecture, I think. Hard to know. Thanks, everybody, for their help.